Good evening and welcome to the Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca. This evening we're going to have a conversation with David Goa, the director of the Chester Ronning Center for the study of the intersection of civil society and religion from the University of Alberta. And we're going to discuss a little bit about some of the Canadians who have become militantized and gone back to the Middle East to actually fight with some radical groups. And not only there were somewhere around 100 Canadians who have done this, but people from the Middle East, Arabs, Iranians, others, who have studied in the West and sometimes been very, very highly regarded in the academic world, who've actually gone back to the Islamic world and become leaders in the Islamic fundamentalist and militant movements. And we'd like to hear, since David Goa has really studied this situation for quite a long while, and also since he teaches comparative religion and has insights into religious sensitivities of various faiths, we'd like to see his opinion and his understanding about why this phenomenon happens, that people are trained in the West, enjoy the democratic system, after they finish their education, to go back and become militant or leaders in the militant Islamic movements. So David, can you give us a few insights into this phenomenon?
Well, I've been concerned about it for some time. You know, a number of what are considered the kind of architects of, I don't like using the term Islam or Muslim with it, to tell you the truth. Mm. I don't like to give these militant movements that credence. Mm. These militant movements that make use of Islam, a number of the architects of that, who kind of shifted the discourse around what constitutes faithfulness, what constitutes the appropriate behavior, what your stance ought to be towards the leadership in your own country, what your stance ought to be towards democracy, towards pluralism, towards the West, towards the secular. Most, if not all, of the architects of those movements over the last 50, 60, 70 years were educated in the West, in the United States, in France, and England. And they then returned to their homelands and proceeded to work to reorient a particular understanding of the faith. So I want to, you know, I've been pondering this a little bit. How can it be that you can come to good universities in the West? You can study English literature, for example, as is the case with Sayyid Qutb, who is the Egyptian who is really the intellectual power behind Al-Qaeda, behind Osama bin Laden. Qutb's brother was Osama bin Laden's teacher. How can it be that you come and study the letters of the West and find yourself in a position where you not only don't have any regard for it, but where you actually see it as a profoundly negative matter? Now, it's interesting what's happened to the humanities in much public universities in the West. Now, I must say, I think this is changing a bit in the last decade. It's begun to change a bit, and I think that change appears to me to be a good change. But we have had the better part of 40, 50 years in which, in much of the humanities, the focus has been, I would say, solely on these three great themes of gender, power, and you know, ethnicity and what have you.
Anti-colonialism.
And then there's been the development of a variety of theories, post-colonialism, postmodernism, a range of these theories, which, frankly, I don't think they're theories. I think they're just little insights around diseases, which have become the primary preoccupation of the professoriate in our universities. So what's been the effect of that? Well, it seems to me that often the effect has been that young people come to study. They come eager to learn about, not just about the critical issues, but in some sense to learn who they are and where they are. What has gone into the creation of the West, whichever West you might think of. What has gone into the various institutions which shape a modern liberal democratic society, law, politics, a whole range of things. But they come out the other end, it seems to me, almost solely with a critique of those institutions, a critique of the ideas that have been significant in the West. Now, I'm not saying that critique isn't important, but I often think of Alfred North Whitehead, you know, the great philosopher who wrote his lovely little book called The Aims of Education. And Whitehead said that the first aim of education is romance. You first must romance the young to the ideas that are significant within the history of the particular civilization and culture in which you stand. The second aim is to help them gain some depth and texture around that. And the third aim is analysis, or we could say critique in the old sense of that word. Well, it seems to me in the humanities we turned that around. And we didn't do the last two then. We did the critique, and we gave them the critique, so they come out with a particular kind of scalpel that they can use on any institution or any idea or any conflict that exists. But they don't come out with any delight in just how extraordinary it is that the West came to be. And what has made it. Now, I'm not inclined to give an apology for the West, but if you only teach the critique, what then do you leave in the landscape of the mind and the heart? So I was thinking about Said Qutb, who did a MA in English Literature at Colorado, I believe it was, University in Colorado, and started writing back to Egypt these quite extraordinary accounts of what he was seeing, which became part of the whole view of the decadent West. In none of those accounts do you see him having been given an idea, a significant idea from the West, in a way that he could field, which actually would have given him a ha-ha moment. He was given all of the evidence from the university itself that the West is decadent and of no accord. Well, this is a huge issue, it seems to me, when you do that. So I have been wondering, Vedika, if in fact there hasn't been a kind of liege relationship between much of our professoriate. I mean, they don't know this, of course, they wouldn't put it this way. But because of that stance, a kind of liege relationship between that and the kind of critical perspectives that have developed in some parts of the Near East, much of the Near East, that has given birth to these very virulent movements. Mm-hmm. So, as I began to think about this, really quite a number of years ago, my own sense was that within modern university education, we had done a great, taken extraordinary strides. It begins with the Enlightenment, but taken extraordinary strides to really do a thorough critique of Christianity and of Christian culture. God knows there's plenty to critique in it. Plenty to critique in it. But I realize that certainly in my own area of religious studies, so many of my generation of professors in religious studies in Canada had come from churches whose fathers had been clergy, or they had been clergy for a period of time, and then they had run afoul of the church or rejected the disciplines or reacted to a bad theology and decided to retool from theological training to religious studies training, and then spent their career doing higher criticism, spent their career putting the axe to the tree of the religious life, as they had known it, as if they knew the whole picture. I mean, that's what's so extraordinary about it. Yeah. It's like the person that leaves the church or some other institution when they're 15 years old, assuming that they actually understood it, and go on and live the rest of their life. And I always say to people like this, well, did you leave mathematics when you were 15? You know, did you abandon it because you didn't like 0? Or did you keep at it and understand it with some depth and some texture? So we've had a dominance in Canada, certainly in the teaching of religious studies, of this kind of hermeneutic of suspicion, to the point that it was pretty clear to me, even many years ago, that most of the students in religious studies classes had no idea what the professor was critiquing. Because they were never taught what they were critiquing. They were only taught the critique. And they were given these straw dogs, which the critique worked on so easily and so well. I remember Jaroslav Pelikan, the great historian of Christian ideas, telling me, I think I've mentioned this story to you before, telling me about a flight back from California to New York, in which when he got on the plane he sat down and thought the man next to him looked vaguely familiar but couldn't place him. And so he started doing his work, and the plane took off and was in the air for an hour or so, and they brought dinner to them, so that dates the story, and put his work away and started to eat his dinner and began to talk to the man next to him. And the man next to him asked him what he did, and Pelikan had just finished writing his book, The Idea of the University. And he was talking to this man about how, from Pelikan's perspective, the key task is to teach the tradition. How do you give students the tradition, open up all these sources, all these ideas, all these images, all these narratives, in a way so that students will come to have a deeply furnished mind, which matches what has happened in the West. This is not about whether you buy it all or not. It's knowing enough so that you can actually begin to think about what it means now. In any case, Pelikan, as you will recall, didn't need to breathe very much when he taught, so he went on for 45 minutes and then stopped for a moment, and this man sitting next to him said, "Well, sounds like you and I do pretty much the same thing." At which point, Jaroslav Pelikan recognized who this man was. It was Johnny Unitas, the quarterback for the Denver Broncos. And Pelican was for a moment flummoxed and said to him, what do you mean? And Johnny Unitas said, well, you've been telling me about what you think you're doing, which is teaching the tradition and throwing it to students so that when they arrive in positions of authority and significance in our society, they'll actually know where all this came from. And they'll know that there's a variety of things to be done. They'll be able to think about it. As opposed to the other professors who you've mentioned, who are teaching their students for today, who are throwing whatever their ideas are, their ideology, to the students where they stand today. I'm a quarterback. I never throw the ball to where somebody is standing, because once it gets there, they'll be gone. I have to throw it to where they arrive, to where they're going to be when they arrive, when the ball arrives there. So it seems to me that that's what you're doing. You're throwing this thing called the tradition to them so that when they arrive in important positions, they will actually have furnished minds and know what to do. Pelican said to me, why is it that a quarterback who never graduated from high school, from an old Lithuanian family, coal miners, understood in 40 minutes, and most of my colleagues at Yale don't? So my point is simple. When you teach simply the critique without laying the foundation, I wonder if you don't create a kind of anomie. And here, 30 years ago, I realized that my concerns around that as it related to Christian culture, the Judeo-Christian tradition, well, that seemed thoroughly done. And we had created a kind of culture of amnesia around that. I realized about 30 years ago that we were now doing the same thing to the tree of the civil life. We were putting the axe to the tree of the civil life with the new theories that came forward. So the humanities, as a result, seems to me, I have this concern, in this period of time, has had no feel for its civil responsibility. So if you do that, here's my thesis. If one is successful at that, what do we leave in the minds and hearts of the young for them to continue to explore and continue to learn and continue to cultivate texture around? I think very little. We may actually have cultivated anomie. We may have cultivated a sense of the meaninglessness of life. Now, most students in this society, they will take that meaninglessness and they will turn it into a corporate career because they have some skills. But there's going to be a few, probably more sensitive ones, who are going to find that intolerable. And so what are they going to do? So when we look at, and there's not enough known about this yet, but when we look at why it is that some young people, some converts to Islam, or to what they think Islam is, and others who were born in various parts of the Muslim world or in Canada, and who end up becoming radicalized. It is a great curiosity to me that the majority of these people are graduates of our universities. So the question is, what kind of an education are they getting which would make it possible? Obviously there are people who are mentally ill and get captured by things. There's no question about that. But one needs to at least raise the question, is there something else that's gone on here in our whole approach which is actually contributing to a barren world of meaning, which allows an enormous appetite to come up the center and to seek a kind of whole picture, a total package. Give me a religion, give me a culture, give me a society, give me a group, and give me something to die for.
You know, I remember discussing probably 20 years ago, maybe more, about how teachers of religion are sometimes teachers of anti-religion, or they tear the basis of faith apart, and so critique it that there's really not so much left of it. And I could see how, from a point of view of somebody who comes from, say, Islam, when they hear supposedly Christian teachers teaching, sort of dissecting and deconstructing the Christian faith, then perhaps I think it's worth fighting against it in some way. But the other thing is, I wonder to what degree we destroy the idealism of so many young people in the way things are taught. That, you know, to undermine idealism among our own people and sort of spur a different kind, a negative kind of idealism among, say, the Muslim students who are here.
Well, many students do come with real aspirations and with idealism. Stanley Fish, great American scholar who wrote a column regularly in the Chronicles of Higher Education, said here quite a number of years ago, when Jacques Derrida died, he was called by a journalist and asked, what's going to replace the triumvirate of race, gender, and power? What's going to replace it? And now that Derrida is dead, because that triumvirate is, I think, almost decimated the humanities, in my view. Stanley Fish, who had not been any great friend of religion, immediately said religion. And the reason is, this is after 9/11. Fish said, are we ready? Because there are students as well as colleagues now in the university who, but certainly students, who come to the university because they are interested in religion, because they're seeking something, and because in some cases they stand somewhere. What are we going to do about this? Are we ready? Because they aren't just coming to learn something of an abstract nature. They're coming also to find a way of living their life fruitfully into the future. And if you don't find a way to live your life fruitfully, you will find a way to live it with very dark and negative kind of implications. So it's a concern I have. I mean, it may not be, I don't think we know yet quite enough, but it does speak to me about, I mean, I see so many students that come and spend 2, 3, 4 years in the university and have some good experiences, no doubt. But so many of them come to the end of it and say to themselves, what is it really for? And what is it really about? And the humanities, in my view, if it is about anything, it is about the opportunity to think with many of the great thinkers and artists of the world about two things. Who am I? And what do I then do? And these questions, circumambulating around the good, the true, and the beautiful, have animated the world of letters, you know, for 3,000 years in the West. And yet, the good, the true, and the beautiful have been largely banished by humanities departments and replaced by, you know, notions of information, notions of critical thinking, things of that nature. So the encounter, I think this is largely a question of encounter, the encounter with the great ideas, the great images, the great narratives of the tradition. Not that they're right, it's just they're great. And they give you room to wrestle and to think. That has become rare. I had an experience just last week. You know, I'm doing a little work in the maximum security prison just outside of Edmonton. I meet every couple of weeks with a with a gentleman there who's been in for quite some time, and he's been deeply interested in questions of justice and what have you. So we've been having a set of conversations which has led me to suggest that perhaps we should read Plato's Apology together. So I brought it with me and gave it to him, and then I came back 2 weeks later, and he of course had read it. And then I said, well, shall we read it together? He said, yeah, let's read it together. So we sat there, and there's nothing like doing this in a prison with somebody who's got in this very particular place. And so we read out loud, back and forth to each other, the Apology for about 2 hours, read about half of it. And I mean, it almost makes your hair stand up on end to see a young man, never graduated from high school, with a bright mind, who suddenly hears a text which is at once about him and calling him to something greater. It is about him and calling him to something greater. And, you know, he gets tears in his eyes and says, that's God. That's where I am. That's where I am. So when you see that kind of gravity, which I think all civilizations are extraordinary. And surely the West is extraordinary too. And when you see that it can provide a landscape for the young to think and to grapple and to struggle, to not give them that seems to me to be a reflection of that extraordinary text we have in the Gospel where Jesus Christ says, and if your neighbor comes to you by night and asks for bread, do you give them a stone? If they ask for fish, do you give them a snake?
Yeah. Well, that's actually a good similitude of it. It's because you wonder to what degree students of the last few decades have been grounded in the roots and sources of liberal democracy, which shapes our country. And to have a grasp of it and where it came from and the struggle with which it came.
Right.
And the struggle that's absolutely necessary in order to maintain it.
Right.
But if you don't know where it came from, the roots of it, how exactly do you know how to maintain it?
And I think this is the way one can take the measure of that is by the examination of political discourse today. So what does that tell us? It tells us we have made an extraordinary mistake here. Yeah. We have replaced the study of that with the study of ideology. We have assumed that ideology is politics. Well, it isn't, and it isn't the tradition. Ideology, I use a kind of image for this, ideology, it seems to me, is a spotlight that you can shine usually on a problem. And that's not unimportant. We need to do that. But when you assume that that is giving you the picture, the full picture, you've made a huge mistake. So we have got this kind of silo political discourse in which there isn't one worthy political idea.
No, and when we've Karl-Rovised our political discourse in Canada to the point that it's like two marionettes fighting it out in a septic tank sometimes in the political discourse. That's certainly burns out anybody who has real idealism or ideals from politics. Yeah. And makes politics look so ugly and so useless in a way that no wonder people, especially younger people, who might still have some ideals left, just don't participate enough in politics. So we leave it to the ideologues, and the ideologues don't have much to say that's worth hearing, really, ultimately. So that's certainly a concern in it. But anyway, we'll leave this because Professor Goa has given us quite a lot to think about and a number of insights. So we need to let you think about these things a little and see what questions come to your own minds and see what ideas you can come up with yourselves about it.